Hey there. Ready to tackle this whole globalization thing?
Yeah, it's a big one.
We've got a really fascinating mix of sources here. Looks like you're interested in how it's impacting, well, everything. Culture, economics,
Mm-hmm.
trade, tourism, and of course that big question of migration.
Right, and how it all ties into these multicultural societies we're seeing more and more of these days.
Exactly. So what we're going to do is pull out the most important stuff from your sources. Really dig into why it all matters.
Yeah. It's more than just skimming the surface. Globalization is complicated.
Definitely. One of your sources called it a double-edged sword. That really struck me because it does seem like globalization brings both opportunities and a whole bunch of challenges too.
Mhm.
And we see that over and over in what you've given us.
It is. It's a really powerful way to put it. Because on the one hand, you've got globalization driving economic growth, connecting people from all sorts of different cultures,
Right.
spreading new ideas and technologies. But then on the other hand, it can make existing inequalities worse, even lead to what they call cultural homogenization.
Right, where these unique traditions start to fade away.
Yeah, as those global trends kind of take over.
Like I keep thinking about food
Oh, interesting.
because on the one hand we have access to incredible culinary diversity now. I mean,
Yeah.
I can walk down the street and get authentic Ethiopian food,
Yeah, okay, yeah.
But at the same time, there's this worry that all the fast food chains, these, I don't know, globalized tastes, are kind of pushing out local cuisines.
For sure. That's a real concern. And it's a perfect example of that double-edged sword thing. Because while we get exposed to all these new culinary experiences,
Yeah.
there's also the risk that we'll lose the unique flavors and traditions, the things that really define a community's identity, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Your sources actually talk about this. They mention how some countries are actively fighting to protect their culinary heritage. From those forces of globalization, that are trying to homogenize everything.
It's interesting.
They're doing things like promoting traditional cooking methods, safeguarding those local ingredients. Even some of them are trying to get UNESCO recognition for their food cultures.
Oh, wow.
It's pretty amazing to see this awareness growing.
So it's this constant struggle to find that balance, right?
Yeah.
Enjoying what global exchange can bring,
Mm-hmm.
but also holding on to what makes each culture unique.
Absolutely.
Are there, I don't know, any strategies that your sources suggest for actually achieving this?
Well, they talk about this idea of glocalization.
Globalization.
Yeah, it's basically adapting global products or services to fit local tastes and preferences.
Okay.
So, think about McDonald's,
Yeah.
global fast food giant, but they offer different menu items in different countries.
Yeah.
In India, they have vegetarian options because, got to fit those local dietary preferences.
That's a great example.
Yeah, it's a way of acknowledging that cultural difference is important, but still, participating in the global marketplace.
Right. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can engage with globalization, but
Exactly.
not totally give up your cultural identity
You find ways to make it work for you, for your community.
for your country.
Mm.
Now, thinking about the economic side of things,
Hmm.
your sources do mention how globalization can boost economic growth, but they also bring up some potential downsides, especially with inequality.
Oh, for sure. There's this term one of your sources uses. It's called human capital flight.
Human capital flight.
Yeah, and it describes how skilled workers will often migrate from developing countries to developed ones because they're looking for better opportunities.
Makes sense.
But it's a tricky issue. It has both good and bad consequences.
Yeah, you can see how it'd be a loss for the country that's sending those workers. Sort of a drain on their talent pool.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. It's
But at the same time, those workers often send money back home, those remittances.
right.
And that can be a big economic boost.
Absolutely. And your sources actually go into that side of it, too. It's really interesting.
Oh, cool.
They looked at how remittances can have this positive impact on developing economies, talking about how the money often goes directly to families, boosts their income, drives local consumption.
So it kind of circles back.
Yeah. And they also found that remittances can sometimes lead to more entrepreneurship and small business development. So it's like globalization creates this web,
Yeah.
All these things are connected.
Yeah.
What happens in one place has consequences, good and bad, somewhere else.
It's definitely multi-layered. And it feels like technology has a huge part to play in all of this,
Oh, absolutely.
in the flows of people and money, especially.
Yeah, technology has basically broken down so many barriers to communication, to transportation.
Right.
It's easier for people to move around the world, for businesses to operate globally.
One of your sources talks about digital nomadism,
Oh, yeah.
where people can work from anywhere.
Yeah. It's a trend that's changing how we think about national boundaries and work in general.
It really is. It's wild. It makes you wonder, though, how do these changes affect how we see culture and belonging? Like, do national identities even matter as much in this globalized world?
That's a great question, and it's something your sources wrestle with. They suggest that while globalization might weaken those traditional national identities, it can also encourage new forms of what they call cultural hybridity.
Cultural hybridity. I like that.
Yeah, it basically means that globalization isn't just about everything becoming the same, but also about new blended cultural expressions popping up.
Oh, interesting. Do they give any, like, real-world examples of this?
They do. One that's really cool is the evolution of music genres. Like, think about hip-hop.
Okay.
It started in the U.S., but artists all over the world have adopted it, adapted it, mixed in their own local influences, and you get totally new subgenres.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it shows how globalization can actually spark innovation, this sort of cultural cross-pollination.
Like, music becomes this global language, right?
Exactly.
You know, it crosses borders and connects people.
Through those shared rhythms and experiences.
So the arts seem to be at the forefront of this cultural blending. But what about, like, the more formal parts of culture? Language, for instance. Is globalization leading to just, like, one language dominating everything, like English?
Well, you've hit on a really key point there. Your sources do talk about how English is becoming more and more dominant as the language of global communication, for business especially.
Yeah, it feels like you almost have to know at least some English to navigate the online world these days, right?
It does, but then the question becomes, what happens to all those smaller languages?
Yeah.
Do they get lost? Marginalized?
And this whole globalized system.
Your sources address that directly. They talk about how important it is to maintain linguistic diversity. They point to all these efforts to try and preserve languages that are endangered. It's a reminder that even though globalization can connect us, we still have to protect all those different languages and cultures. You know, they're what make the world so vibrant.
Right. Finding that balance again.
Yeah.
Between embracing the global line and valuing those unique identities.
Exactly.
And one place where globalization is super obvious is in trade and tourism.
Definitely.
And your sources really go into how those forces shape economies and societies everywhere.
And they have some really cool insights about how these things that seem separate, trade and tourism, are actually totally intertwined. One of the big points they make is that tourism has become this huge driver of global economic growth.
Wow.
Especially for developing countries. It creates jobs, brings in foreign currency, can even be a powerful tool to fight poverty.
There's that phrase one of your sources uses, how tourism opens doors.
Yeah, I love that.
Literally and figuratively.
Totally. It opens doors to new experiences for travelers, and it opens doors to economic opportunities for the places they're visiting.
Do your sources talk about any downsides to tourism?
They do. They talk about, like, environmental impact.
Yeah.
Or how cultures can get, commodified.
Right.
And they really emphasize how important it is to have responsible and sustainable tourism practices.
Yeah, like, just because you're opening doors
Right.
doesn't mean you don't pay attention to what walks through.
Right.
And what kind of impact that has.
Exactly. What kind of solutions do they offer?
Bro.
Well, one really interesting one is this thing called community-based tourism.
Community-based.
Yeah, it's where local communities are actually part of planning and managing the tourism in their area.
Okay.
So that way, the benefits go to the whole community, not just a few businesses.
Right. Makes sense.
They also talk about how important it is to educate travelers, encourage them to minimize their environmental footprint, and engage with local cultures respectfully.
So it's not just about consuming a destination, right? It's about actually engaging with it in a meaningful way.
Yeah, and realizing we all have a responsibility to protect those natural and cultural treasures that make each place special.
And that idea of shared responsibility seems to come up a lot in your sources, especially when they start talking about migration.
It does, and it's really fascinating how they present migration. It's not just this one singular thing, They highlight all of these different reasons why people migrate.
Yeah.
I mean, historically, it was often because of hardship, people fleeing famine or war.
Right.
And those reasons are still very real. But today, it's way more complex.
For sure. Your sources talk about how people are moving for economic opportunity, for education, even just for, like, lifestyle choices.
Exactly. It's not just about seeking refuge anymore. People are choosing to relocate for personal growth, new experiences.
One source uses the term lifestyle migration.
Yes, it's a great way to put it because it captures how people are drawn to places that offer a different pace of life, maybe more cultural attractions or a better climate.
It's interesting how globalization has made those kinds of choices more possible. But doesn't that also bring up the whole brain drain issue?
Oh, yeah, that's a major concern.
You know, developing countries losing their best and brightest to more developed nations.
Your sources actually present a lot of different perspectives on that. Some really emphasize the negative impacts of brain drain. They argue it holds back economic growth, especially in those sending countries.
Yeah, makes sense.
You know, they point to the loss of skilled professionals in really key areas. Healthcare, education, technology.
Like that's a vital resource flowing out.
Yeah, it leaves gaps that are hard to fill.
But didn't we talk about remittances earlier?
Right.
That money being sent back. Could that help offset some of those negative effects?
That's exactly what your sources dig into.
Yeah.
It's a really complicated interaction. You've got this loss of human capital, but then you have the remittances potentially injecting much needed funds into those developing economies. One of your sources cites a study that actually found that in a lot of developing countries, remittances are bigger than the foreign aid they receive.
Oh, wow.
And they point out that remittances tend to be more stable than other types of financial flows. They're a pretty reliable source of income for families.
It's like this constant push and pull.
It is. Flows of people, flows of money, moving in all directions.
Creating benefits and challenges.
Yeah, finding that balance is key. Maybe by figuring out ways to encourage those skilled professionals to come back home, or at least contribute their expertise remotely.
Your sources offer any solutions along those lines?
They do. There's this idea they talk about called brain circulation.
Brain circulation.
Yeah, and it focuses on how skilled migrants can actually contribute to both their home and their host countries.
Oh, interesting.
It's all about building networks and collaborations. So migrants can share knowledge, skills, maybe even investments across borders.
So it doesn't have to be a one-way street.
Exactly. Migration can be a dynamic process that benefits everyone involved.
I like that. It's a much more hopeful way to look at it.
Yeah. And it really highlights how globalization isn't just about economics or politics. It's about people and the connections they make.
And those connections are often reflected in how cultures change and evolve in these globalized societies. Your sources really dig into the whole idea of multiculturalism.
They do.
What comes to mind when you hear that term?
Well, one of your sources uses this really vivid metaphor. They talk about multicultural societies as a melting pot.
Okay.
Different cultures all blending together, creating something totally new and unique. But they also acknowledge that it's not always a smooth process.
Right. Blending all those different cultures. It can't be easy.
Definitely not. What are some of the challenges that your sources mention?
Well, one that really stands out is this tension between integration and preservation.
So how to encourage newcomers to adapt, right?
Exactly. To the norms and values of their new home. But at the same time, how to let them hold on to their own cultural identities.
That balancing act again. It is. Finding ways to create a sense of unity and belonging without erasing the richness that comes from all that diversity.
Do the sources suggest any, approaches for dealing with this?
One they talk about is intercultural dialogue. Basically, open and respectful communication between people from different backgrounds.
Oh, okay.
So creating spaces where people can share their experiences, talk about their perspectives and values, really trying to foster understanding and empathy.
It seems like that's got to be crucial, right? Building bridges instead of walls.
For sure. But what about the role of government?
Yeah. Do the sources talk about how policies can shape these multicultural societies?
They do. And they emphasize how important it is to have policies that promote equal opportunity and combat discrimination. They discuss the need for inclusive education systems that value diversity, and policies that make sure everyone has equal access to things like housing, healthcare, and jobs.
So creating a truly multicultural society takes effort on multiple levels, right?
Yeah. You need those grassroots efforts like that intercultural dialogue we were talking about, and you need support from the top down, from government policies.
And the goal is to create an environment where everybody feels like they belong.
Exactly, where diversity is seen as a strength,
Yeah.
a source of innovation.
And that brings us to another really important point. How does globalization impact our day-to-day lives?
Right. We've been talking about these big global forces.
Yeah.
But how does it all show up in our routines? The things we buy, the media we consume.
The way we connect with people.
Exactly.
I mean, one obvious example is just the sheer amount of choices we have as consumers.
Right.
Think about food, clothes, technology. So much of it comes from all over the world now.
Globalization has given us access to a wider range of everything than ever before.
Like my local supermarket has an entire aisle dedicated to international foods. It's amazing. But do the sources mention any potential downsides to all this choice?
Oh, yeah. They bring up the ethical side of things. With all this globalized consumption, for example, they talk about fair trade practices, making sure workers in developing countries get paid fairly, that they're working in safe conditions. They also talk about the environmental impact of those global supply chains and the need for more sustainable ways of producing things.
It's like we have to remember that our choices have consequences, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
For people and the planet.
Yeah. We have to think about where our stuff comes from, how it's made.
And it goes beyond just buying things. Globalization has changed how we consume information and media, too. The internet and social media connect us to a constant stream of news, opinions, perspectives from all over the world.
It really has made the world feel so much smaller. I can connect with my friends and family who live across the globe, and I'm always learning about different cultures and stuff through social media.
It's amazing. But your sources warn about some of the downsides of that constant connection, too.
Oh, right.
They talk about information overload.
Information overload.
Yeah, that feeling of being bombarded with so much information that it's just overwhelming. Like you can't even process it all. And it can lead to anxiety, fatigue. You can even feel detached from the real world.
Totally. Like you're scrolling endlessly through your phone.
Yeah.
Seeing all this news, these opinions.
Yeah.
And it's hard to know what to believe or what to even pay attention to.
It's so common these days. And your sources point out that it can get even worse because of all the misinformation and disinformation out there.
Oh, yeah.
You know, stuff that erodes trust, makes it even harder to tell what's real and what's not.
So we need to get better at critical thinking.
Absolutely.
And being more media literate.
Being able to evaluate sources, recognizing biases, forming our own opinions, it's more important than ever.
It's like we need to be active participants in figuring out what's true, not just passively consuming whatever comes at us.
Exactly.
And that brings us to the big question.
Yeah.
What happens next with globalization?
I like-
Is this just an unstoppable force? Or can we actually influence it?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right? It is. It's a really tough one. But your sources do give us some really interesting ideas about where globalization might be headed.
One thing they all seem to agree on is that globalization's not going away.
Right.
It's here to stay, not some passing fad.
It's woven into, like, everything these days.
Exactly. And in fact, they suggest it's probably going to keep speeding up.
Yeah.
Driven by, well, technology for sure, but also by how economically dependent countries are becoming on each other and how connected people and cultures are getting.
It's all intertwined, but the real question is, what kind of globalization are we talking about?
Yeah, what will it look like?
Right. Will it make inequality worse? Erase cultural differences? Or can we somehow make it more equitable?
More sustainable.
More inclusive.
That's really what it comes down to, right?
Yeah.
Not just accepting that globalization's happening,
Yeah.
but actually trying to steer it in a positive direction.
Exactly. And your sources do talk about that. They use this phrase, responsible globalization.
Responsible globalization.
Yeah, a model where the focus is on human well-being, taking care of the environment, and promoting social justice.
That sounds like a really ambitious goal. Do they, lay out specific steps for how we might actually achieve this?
They do. And it's a multi-pronged approach. One key thing they talk about is strengthening global governance.
Okay.
So more cooperation between countries to deal with those big transnational challenges like climate change, poverty, inequality.
Yeah, you can't really tackle those on country-by-country basis.
Exactly. They need global solutions. And they also talk about the need for better regulations for global markets, making sure things are fair, protecting human rights.
It feels like those big top-down approaches need to be paired with what's happening on the ground, though.
Right.
Like with citizens and communities taking action.
Absolutely. And your sources talk a lot about how crucial civil society is in creating change.
Oh, interesting.
They talk about grassroots movements, consumer activism, social entrepreneurship, all these ways people are pushing for ethical consumption, sustainability, social responsibility.
It's like that saying, think globally. act locally.
Yeah. It takes on a whole new meaning when we're talking about globalization.
It really does. It's a reminder that we all have a part to play in shaping the world, right? No matter where we live or what we do.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that globalization isn't just something happening to us.
Oh.
We can influence it through our choices, our actions, how we interact with the world around us.
So where does all of this leave us? Like if someone's been listening to this whole conversation, what's the main message they should take away, especially about globalization?
I think the biggest thing to remember is that globalization has this incredible power, this incredible potential. It can be used for good or bad. And it's really up to us, all of us, to decide how we use it, what kind of future we want to create.
That's a really powerful thought. And it really makes you realize that we're not just bystanders, right?
All right.
We're all active participants in shaping how this unfolds.
And that's a huge responsibility, one we should all take seriously.
I hope this deep dive has given our listeners some new insights and perspectives.
Yeah, some tools to help them navigate this whole globalization thing.
Because it's complex.
Yeah.
And it's always changing.
And it's definitely not over. Keep asking those questions. Stay curious. Keep exploring this interconnected world we live in. It is a tough one.
Yeah, but I think your sources do give us some clues about where things might go.
They do seem to agree that globalization is, well, it's not going anywhere.
Right. It's not like we can just, hit the brakes and reverse it.
Exactly. It's part of the world now. And they actually think it's probably going to accelerate.
Yeah.
Driven by all those things we've talked about, technology, countries depending on each other more and more, people and cultures becoming more connected.
It's all part of the same, the same web. But I think the real question is, what kind of globalization will it be?
Right. What will it look like? Exactly. Will it just make inequality worse? Will it wipe out cultural differences?
Or can we steer it towards something better?
More equitable.
More sustainable.
More inclusive. Yeah.
So it's not just about knowing it's happening, right?
No.
It's about actually trying to shape it.
Exactly. And your sources talk about that. They use this phrase, responsible globalization.
Responsible globalization.
Yeah, like a model where the focus is on, human well-being, making sure we're taking care of the environment, and that we're promoting social justice.
That sounds great in theory, but is it even, possible?
Well, your sources actually lay out some concrete steps we can take to move towards that model.
Oh, cool.
And it's a pretty multifaceted approach. One big thing they talk about is strengthening global governance.
Okay, so what does that mean exactly?
Well, it means better cooperation between nations.
Right.
So they can work together on those massive global challenges like climate change, poverty, inequality.
Because those issues don't stop at borders.
Exactly. They need global solutions.
Right. Makes sense.
And they also talk about the need for better regulations of those global markets to make sure things are fair and that people's rights are protected.
But it feels like all that top-down stuff needs to be balanced with, action from the ground up. People, communities actually doing things.
For sure. And your sources highlight how important civil society is in driving change.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
Well, they talk about all sorts of things. Grassroots movements, consumer activism, social entrepreneurship. All of these ways that individuals and groups are pushing for ethical consumption, sustainability, social responsibility.
So think globally, act locally.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It takes on this whole new meaning in the context of globalization.
Really does. It's a good reminder that we all have a part to play, right?
For sure. It's not just about these big abstract forces.
Yeah, it's about what we do, what we choose.
It's how we interact with the world. We can influence it.
So after all of this, what's the message for our listener, the one who's been with us this whole time, trying to wrap their head around all these ideas about globalization?
I think the most important thing to remember is that globalization has this huge power and this huge potential.
Yeah, it can go either way.
Exactly. Yeah. It can be used for good or for bad. And it's up to us, to all of us, to decide how we use it, what kind of future we build with it.
That's a powerful thought. It really is. It means we're not just watching this happen, right?
Right. We're shaping it.
We all have a responsibility to think about that, to make choices that lead to a better world.
Exactly. And I think that's what your sources are really trying to get across.
Well, we've only just scratched the surface here, but hopefully this deep dive has given our listeners some new ways of thinking about all this.
Yeah, some food for thought, some new perspectives.
Because it is complicated, this whole globalization thing.
Yeah.
And it's constantly changing.
It is. So, yeah, keep asking questions, keep learning, keep exploring.
And thanks for joining us for this deep dive into globalization.